I could never have done it because I'm the first one to sense of direction ever.
I'll text Hillary and say, hey, I put those boxes on the north side of the house. And she's like, the north side, what is, which side, the back or the front? It's like, how do you not know that the back side of the house, the north side of the, but it's just in my head.
Hey everyone, welcome back to Asemio Decoded. We are thrilled to share our conversation with Brandon Lenhart, Vice President of Operations at Argonaut Private Equity, though it is a slight departure from our typically tech and social impact focused conversations. Brandon is a friend of the pod and has been in one high pressure environment after another. He graduated from the Navy Fighter Weapons School, Top Gun, served in the U.S. Navy as an FA-18 Naval Flight Officer, completed his MBA at Wharton, and went on to a career in investment banking and now private equity. You may be wondering how we're going to connect the dots here, but working at the intersection of innovative data, technology, and the systemic problems that vulnerable communities are facing is high demand too. The technical and ethical problems we tackle are high stakes, and it's important to get things right, be resilient, and stay focused on the mission. So, enter this conversation with Brandon. This episode was born out of a conversation about excellence that we felt warranted some airtime. We saw an opportunity to have a dialogue on what the overlaps are between these high-demand, high-pressure environments that really require you to strive towards a particular level of excellence. When much is demanded of you, you may find yourself managing a lot of different feelings. We certainly experience this and suspect that many of you do too. Things like burnout and imposter syndrome and chronic stress. You're going to hear a lot about Brandon's backstory, partly because we think it's pretty cool. And then you're also going to hear a lot about the commonalities between these seemingly unrelated environments that carry a lot of the same kinds of risks. What does it mean to strive for excellence? How do we get back up when we fail? And how do we process the feelings that come with a relentless strive for something greater than ourselves?
I really enjoyed this conversation with Brandon that we had today. It hit a lot of varying topics, including the role of centralization and decentralization and organizational leadership and design, the overlap and institutions that are striving for social good and government and military, role of sacrifice and being people first in our society today. It's just full of nuggets of wisdom and learning.
Yeah, so I'm Brandon Lenhart. I live right here in Tulsa, Oklahoma. I work for a private equity fund here called Argonaut Private Equity. I'm a vice president here. Prior to moving to Tulsa, we lived in New York. I worked at an investment bank called Goldman Sachs. Prior to my career in finance, I guess in the private sector, I was a U.S. naval officer, and I did that for 11 years. I was an F-18 weapon systems officer, so think of a backseater and a two-seat F-18. The best way to describe it, I guess, is Goose and Top Gun. Thanks for having me.
Did you always know that you wanted to end up in the military? How did you?
Yeah, growing up in a sort of lower middle income family, I felt like going to Annapolis was sort of a ticket out of my little town. And I think I really wanted to go there, to be honest with you, because it was sort of this, I was kind of told like it's impossible for you to get into that school. And I was this snot-nosed kid, I think, growing up, and it was like, well, I'll prove you wrong. And that, to be all honest, that was 90% of the reason that I went there. There certainly was some patriotism, very close to my grandmother, who was a patriot. But something happened my freshman year at the Naval Academy, and that was 9/11. And I think, after that, I think my classmates and I all kind of looked at each other knowing, wow, we signed up for something, and overnight it has completely changed. And my entire 11 years was, we were in combat. I did 4 combat deployments over those 11 years. For me, that literally looked like graduating from learning to fly the F-18, and 2 days later, I'm walking on board the USS Ronald Reagan to go on a 7-month deployment. to Afghanistan.
Well, first, thank you for your service. And second, your journey is similar. So my great uncle, he will be 95 this year, and he was in the Air Force, but the Air Force didn't exist when he started. And so he was a naval pilot, and kind of similar thing. He grew up in West Virginia, and I think was just looking for a path out, and also, kind of proving people wrong, but like, you can get out of here, you can do something more, you can, achieve. And he pulled himself out of that, like, and had virtually no support. He became an officer and just did amazing things. And, he's still love. I'm like, I'm gonna have to ask him about the F-18 Super Hornet because he probably knows what that is.
It's, join the Navy, see the world. That is absolutely true. The cities that I was able to see coming from, little Coweta, Oklahoma, I never would have had those opportunities if it hadn't been for, going to the Naval Academy.
It makes me wonder just how deep this story goes into the American psyche, because my grandfather from Covington, Texas, and he would take me, also grew up in poverty. He actually would take me to the farm that he later owned in Covington. And on the way, he would point out, and I don't know if this is one of those old school Texas tall tale things, or he actually literally was telling me the story that actually happened. He would point over and see over right in that field right there. That's where I left my cotton sack whenever I was 14 years old and went and joined the Navy, because I was out there picking cotton, and I left, and he had no options, no money, like very poor family. And he went and served, and it was the same thing. He, didn't have other options, and he went and was, later, I would go through, and I didn't have any understanding of what that meant when I was a kid. I would just see these old medals and a knife and these random things in cabinets that I would pull out and look at and think, wow, these are cool. And he didn't really tell me many stories. I'm actually very sad about that, because I didn't learn much about what that meant to him, and he's no longer with us. But here we are, three people, and a different, parts, you yourself, Brandon, but like different parts of our families saw that service as a way to shift a part of their life and either see a part of the world or change a socioeconomic circumstance.
Yeah, I think you're right. And it wasn't until, maybe midway through my career where I thought, okay, I'm probably going to get out of the Navy and go do something different. And I, at the time, felt so blessed and sort of so confident that, wow, I have this story that I can tell now. And without the Navy, I don't think I ever would have had this sort of American way story I think you're referring to, Aaron, that I could tell in that first job interview, or writing the essays to try to get into the best business school I could possibly try to get into. I didn't even know these opportunities even existed or what they were until I went through all that.
What do you think is the biggest misconception about enlisting or being in the military?
I think the first time I saw the misconception was actually at the warden school, and taking a management exam, which was written by one of the professors there, is named Adam Grant, who's a famous sort of leadership or management author. And one of the questions was something along the lines of, you have this boss who's a former Navy fighter pilot, and he's rigid. How would you react? And I thought, wow, like, that's the way Adam Grant thinks about us. Now, I'm sure it was just a question, but I think there's probably some truth to it. And there's probably some data that supports it as well. I think, but in all honesty, I think it's a misconception. And I think being around the ready room, 3 deployments on an aircraft carrier, that misconception could not be more wrong. I think the amount, first off, the amount of intelligence in the room, the smartest people I've ever been around was in that ready room in a fighter squadron. Also, just the calm and peace that these pilots sort of display, and it looks like they just inherently have, I think, is remarkable. I mean, think about it. It's a rough night in the Pacific Ocean. It's as black as the inside of a basketball outside because it's so dark, it's no moon. And there's a pitching deck, and the pilots are landing these aircraft carriers are landing in a jet on an aircraft. And then they come down in the ready room and they're just so calm and collected. I'm actually just kind of astonished by it. I think thinking back on it, and I think I bring that up because I've seen that calm and that sort of calm, centered intelligence. I've seen it in the private sector too. A lot of my colleagues have made it out into a world of finance, and they still have that.
Calm.com defines mental toughness as the capacity to persistently pursue goals and remain determined even when things are hard. There's a cultural tendency we have as a society, I think, to assume you're either born with this skill or not. And it comes down to this idea of grit. You're tough or you're not. You're strong or you're weak. You're cut out for high-stakes environments or you just can't hang. But when you look at the qualities of mental toughness, it's about emotional intelligence, something we all have to learn and work at for our entire lives. Calm says it's a mixture of emotional resilience, confidence, adaptability, boundary setting, and self-awareness. So when it comes to being a calm-centered leader for the people around you, maybe we need to resist the urge to take the tough it out approach that a lot of us grew up hearing. Instead, we need to ask ourselves, how can we approach a problem with clear communication, an awareness and acceptance of the emotions that we're experiencing, and a confidence that you and your team are capable of the challenges and obstacles that inevitably arise.
They're not rigid. They're not difficult to work for. In fact, I think it's some of the best leaders I've seen in the private sector.
If you're in a situation that's high risk, you can't just stop and be like, so let's talk about the different options here and maybe, well, no, that may be right. How do you feel about, like, someone has to be the one to make a decision, whereas outside of that high risk type of situation, in like a lot of the business world, you can pause, you can stop. And there's businesses that are command and control and centralized folks. There's also ones that are more decentralized and a little more collaborative in that sense. But Brandon, do you think there's an element of centralization of control, power, information, and decision-making there that's at play?
Well, yeah. I mean, clearly there's a chain of command, and the chain of command is used every single time in the military. Oh, by the way, along with that chain of command, there's rules of engagement. There's clear SOPs. There's clear doctrine, an enormous amount of training that by the time you get to making that decision, you kind of damn well know what to do. The best organizations that I saw in the military were kind of highly decentralized. You know, take, for example, I spent 2 years with SEAL Team 7. This was my last tour of duty. I knew I was going to be headed to business school, so I stepped away from the cockpit and worked for SEAL Team 7. I was not a SEAL. I was the naval aviator on staff and did some sort of like special projects and work for them. But I deployed with them in Iraq in 2015. And this is where I saw kind of the just masterclass hub and spoke model decentralization. You know, we were in Baghdad, but this SEAL team was split up into, sort of platoons scattered across Iraq, and then even scattered outside Iraq at places I can't even mention. But the skipper of that team in Baghdad had a desk right next to me. And I just couldn't believe the amount of responsibility given to some young lieutenant leading his platoon in the middle of nowhere, Iraq. And the amount of trust that skipper gave that lieutenant to just report back to me once a week what's going on. But I trust you to make some, very big decisions.
There's a metaphorical like rhyming that happens in the space that we work in around data and technology, because we're working on really complex, wicked social problems like homelessness and lack of access to education and poverty. And what we've seen is decentralized, like highly autonomous, decentralized, high-performing organizations that use technology and data are the best way to attack those complex problems. And when I think in the military, it's the Top Gun teams, the SEAL teams that hit the most complex problems. So it's fascinating that kind of tracks there, whereas you may have an organization like We work a lot with government organizations that are highly centralized, but at the end of the day, you have to have this combination of centralization and decentralization and expertise and specialty and generalization all coming together to really make those shifts in the world that we want to see. So that's fascinating.
I think part of it is sort of the values or sort of the central core principles of these organizations. I can think of my time at Goldman Sachs. I believe Goldman Sachs is a very high performing investment bank. They had sort of these core principles that they truly did live by. I think one, as you're sort of alluding to was partnership. And that partnership was, I think, very important to its other core principle, which was this high dedication to their clients. And that partnership allowed these ideas to be spread across the entire floor and even across the entire firm. It's a very large firm. I think that was essential to Goldman Sachs performing at a very high level.
The frequency with which Brandon is talking about these core principles during this conversation was so validating. We talk about our core values at Asemio a lot, and we check in with our team every year just to make sure that they still resonate, that they represent who we want to be as an organization. And we believe that staying aligned on the driving principles that your team shares makes us more connected, provides deeper meaning and guidance to our work, and helps us achieve that level of excellence that we've been talking about.
There's this interesting book called The Starfish and the Spider that talks about starfish organizations, and the metaphor is if you cut off a limb of a starfish, it grows back, and then the spider, if you cut off a limb of spiders, they die. And one of the essence or the core tenets of decentralized organizations is this idea of transmitting those values throughout the decentralized components. So exactly what you're talking about is replicated there. And the examples given in the book are organizations like Wikipedia or the open source software community or Alcoholics Anonymous, where you put these values in and then you can pop up in a different place in Wikipedia or open source software community or an AA group in a different place, but there's this core principles that you're aligned to, they're still there.
You can have clear, transparent values, and an organization could still fail if you don't have the right people and the right mindset. So what is that?
There's some core values I think are really imperative, to these high performers. Hard work, I think, is necessary across all the high performing organizations that I've seen, even from an individual standpoint, right? I'm in the recovery community. Aaron mentioned it a little earlier. There's one thing they often say is half measures availed us nothing. I think that's really true. Half measures are only going to get these half results. There's no pride, I don't think, in half results. At some point, there's this pride. I think it's the American way, right? That hard work is going to, at some point, produce some hard results.
How the do you balance that? Because then you're constantly burning yourself out, right? And I think we can. I'm going to project all over the three of us. We all are high burners. Okay, we can burn ourselves high, right? But how do you get, and I'm asking almost personally as someone in their mid 40s, and Jess is almost a decade back there, so she's going to be dealing with this soon, is how do you know when too much is too much? How do you get that balance? How do you not let that drive consume you and those around you?
I have burnout, Aaron. I've hit my breaking point at some point here. I'm goal driven. I've been goal driven since I was a kid. I grew up in a house where it was B stood for busted. So we didn't make B's on our report card. So at some point, it was just sort of ingrained us to set a goal and go achieve it. I talk about me and my siblings. I think the perfect example of this, Aaron, was when I was at Goldman Sachs. I was an investment banker, and you worked 100-hour work weeks. You did, and it was brutal. But during my time there, I think there was a lot of media and news stories about this, right? Bank of America or Morgan Stanley or Goldman Sachs investment bankers that were just burning out, and something tragic would happen. They started asking, is it worth having our bankers work 90 plus hours in a week? Does that even maximize value? Because at hour 108, how much value is that analyst or that associate actually providing our firm?
Humor can be a great way to deal with hard things and connect over a relatable experience. But honestly, y'all, burnout is really serious. It's too common, and it's more than just a passing joke. Psychology Today defines burnout as a state of emotional, mental, and often physical exhaustion brought on by prolonged or repeated stress, and says, though it's most often caused by problems at work, it can also appear in other areas of life, such as parenting, caretaking, or romantic relationships. It can compound too. So the longer it goes on, the worse the symptoms can get, and the more exponentially difficult it becomes to recover. So ignoring it and going for that third cup of coffee might not be the most effective solution long term. A common misconception is that hard work has to mean stressful work, that you've reached a successful day or week only if you are absolutely spent by the end of it. But burnout is a major driver behind increased distraction and decreased motivation, two things that will ultimately kill that productivity. So while that cycle of exhaustion can feel like proof that you're working hard, what it might actually be indicating is that you're just not showing up as your best self to your life, not to mention your important work. You're missing out on untapped potential. And this isn't new thinking either. A Time article from 2020 titled "Rest Takes Hard Work" cites a number of policymakers and thinkers going back 200 years. And these folks spoke aspirationally about a workforce that was more productive, less stressed, and generally working less. One of my favorite modern thinkers on this topic is Cal Newport. Newport is an MIT-trained computer scientist, professor at Georgetown University, and author of several books, with his most recent being Slow Productivity: The Lost Art of Accomplishment Without Burnout. Now there's a title for you. And while burnout is more common to talk about these days, it's statistically on the rise, according to Indeed.com, which says that 52% of employees say they feel burned out in 2024, up from 43% pre-pandemic. And this isn't just an issue of productivity and feeling dissatisfied at your job, y'all. Chronic burnout is linked to health conditions. A 2020 study in the European Journal of Preventive Cardiology links burnout to heart conditions. WebMD offers a great breakdown on the types of burnout, the signs of it progressing, and what you might be able to do about it. You can find the link in the show notes. Acceptance and admittance is one of the first suggested steps, so it looks like the three of us are on our way. Me, personally, I am trying to find more ways than I ever have before to take advantage of my PTO. This is like an ongoing conversation that Aaron and I have. Even last night I had dinner with a friend, and her first question to me was, so are you working a lot still, or have you slowed down a little? I'm like, oh damn. But the idea of just like a sustainable pace, right? Because then you're a functioning human. You can show up in the places you need to. These are all really great intellectual things to know, but to also feel it like on a body level, that's hard, and to implement it. I mean, that's like probably a struggle that many people share. I think a part of that is like having the space to fail, right? To learn, and then to move on from that, and to move out of like the beyond the identity of the person that failed in this way, that fails in this way, right? So has that been your experience, Brandon, in the organizations that you've worked in? Has that always been true and present?
Yeah, I think room to fail, I think is really important. I can think of an example. One of like a mentor of mine, and one of the first commanding officers I had was a guy named Cato de la Cruz. He now leads a nonprofit, a very large nonprofit called Team Rubicon. He was a skipper of a fighter squadron, and I was in his squadron. He was a Top Gun graduate. He was actually a Top Gun instructor, so really sort of looked up to him, and a lot of my peers did as well. But I remember one flight in particular. We were at sea, like in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, and it was one of these flights where I was the flight lead. And it was like a 4 versus 6. So like on the good side, I'm leading 4 jets and we're fighting 6 jets. And it was like a night flight. It was around the boat. It was one of those sort of flights. And I was just overconfident, and I thought I'm good enough. I can just kind of wing this. And I realized that I was briefing a former Top Gun instructor from a different squadron, the subject matter expert in the Navy on the very topic I'm briefing. And I thought, oh boy. And I had a very poor brief. And then I led a very poor flight. It was an absolute disaster. It was such a bad flight that Cato, my skipper, sort of heard about it and pulled me to the side. And I thought, oh boy, what's he going to say to me? But just his level of composure, I think, with me was just a true testimony of leadership. And it was simply along the lines of, these flights are going to happen. Don't let this one event, this one flight, dictate who you are as a naval aviator. Instead, how about we just learn from this? Don't have another flight like that again, and maybe a little more stern. But that really, I needed that in that moment. Mistakes are going to get made. You know, oftentimes we acquire these companies, we acquire a controlling interest in these companies. Oftentimes we have to sit down with the founder and say, listen, mistakes are going to be made. They're going to do things differently than you used to do. But there has to be room for that CEO, that new CEO, to make that mistake. I think that's really important to a high-performing organization. There's room for mistake.
So I do have to, all this talk of excellence, I do have to point out that one of the areas of excellence in Brandon in my overlap life here is through soccer. And our daughters are on this team, the Galaxy Girls. And I love this model of this team because it's in some, I'm not a big sports guy, but it's, you know, there's competitive and rec and different sports. And it's this rec plus area that's a little more than rec. You can choose or somehow influence team members that are selected. But this team's whole goal is to have competitive level performance without requiring the dues and necessarily training schedule and traveling all the time. And they kick ass.
They do. Maybe like a key principle there is confidence, because here we are, these 10 and 11-year-old girls, the amount of confidence they have when they step on the field, it is awesome to see. It is awesome.
When they play top performing teams that they, you know, and they're usually losing by one, winning by one, like it's a 50-50 game, is some of the best because the excellence you see, the footwork, the strategy, all from 10 to 11-year-old girls is absolutely amazing. So I think, you know, some of that makes me wonder, you know, Brandon, what do you think about a little bit of this as a nature nurture conversation? Like how much of it is the environment that you're creating for your daughter and yourself and those around you? How much of it is inherent of this drive that we have around excellence and high performance? What's, you know, I don't know, what is the training at Wharton say, or the latest blog post that y'all have read or your own personal experience say about that?
My daughter, for example, some of the things that I'm hoping to teach her and we talk about often is direct, open, and honest communication. Ability to take feedback, right? How can we lead an organization if we cannot hold ourselves accountable and then hold others accountable, and then that person not have the ability to receive that constructive feedback? I think it's really important for my daughter and children to grow up with this understanding that constructive feedback doesn't mean something about you as a person. Hopefully it's just steering you in the right direction so you can perform at an excellent level. It's core principles, it's transparency, these core principles, and building an entire organization or a person, right, or an individual around those core principles.
You know, that phrase, luck favors the prepared, right? So I think it's multidimensional. I think there's nuance in everything. And even what does prepared mean, right? Because on one hand, it's okay, are you showing up? Do you have discipline in the areas you need to have discipline in? Are you willing to be and actively being introspective? Have you also had the opportunities, right? Did you have the doors? Did you know about some opportunity? Not everybody has that, right? So there's limits that is just not fair.
I like what you said about the preparedness, just an extreme amount of training before we're ever landing on an aircraft carrier or going to combat or something like that. I can think of this story, and I don't share a lot of stories sort of around my combat experience, but there is one in particular. There's a flight over Afghanistan. I was in the back seat of a guy named Jeff Fellows. I was a very junior weapon system officer, and he was a pretty strong and experienced pilot. But here we were together over Afghanistan, and we found ourselves in the middle of a firefight. Okay, and there were guys on the ground who were taking fire. I believe they're Australian. Their position was actually getting overrun. And over the radio, you could hear fire. You could hear a machine gun. You could hear sort of the fear in his voice. He said, "This call sign is heads down." For him to say it that way, I think it's always just stuck with me. This call sign is heads down. It wasn't, "I'm scared, holy shit, I'm getting fired at," or to maintain that level of professionalism in such a scary moment, I think goes back to sort of that level of preparedness that you're referring to, right? It is he's simulated this scenario so many times that in that moment, and that moment is scary. There was a lot of fear. He was still able to maintain that professionalism. But goes back to how important that level of preparedness is in performing to excellence.
Thank you for sharing that story. That gives me chills to think about that. And I think, it's certainly not the same, but there's a lot of, conversation, and I've experienced this too, like when that simulation of high stress and being able to just stay grounded in that. Again, the scale and intensity here is quite different, but whether you're practicing meditation or yoga or you're doing martial arts, right? You're putting yourselves intentionally in these positions where like stuff is coming at you, you're having to work at high intensity, and you're having to part of your objectives, one of your objectives may be to, stay grounded, focus on your breath, move through it, and build the tolerance and the resilience to those situations too, so that, when you're in a to bring it into the professional space too, you're in a tough meeting, you're getting called on the carpet for something, you've got some kind of challenging news that you need to share with your team, and you have to bring strength in that position. Having those opportunities to simulate that, even just from an emotional perspective, I think can go a long way towards that. And you're right, the training required for those kinds of situations that you just described is quite different than
Right.
but even still.
I was talking with someone last night about this, and there's a whole skill to psychologically not trapping yourself or being your own worst enemy and just giving yourself grace and not shaming yourself, so that you can have the foundation when you're not in your best self to get back to your best self, right? And we've talked a lot about some of the psychological factors that are at play and pressure, and I think that shame and guilt is a huge toxic emotion in our society. Where if we're not, especially if you're a high performer, you have goals that you want to reach, and you're not reaching those, it's not additive, right? I'm not saying you shouldn't criticize and improve, but shame is subtractive and guilt is subtractive. And so you need to hold yourself to a standard and also not let those toxic emotions eat away at it.
Brene Brown, a famous therapist, would say that, guilt is actually acceptable, but shame is not. I think she's spot on.
Brene Brown is an American researcher and storyteller who spent 2 decades studying courage, vulnerability, shame, and empathy. You might know her name as a widely acclaimed author and talk show guest, or you might have seen her TED Talk on the power of vulnerability, which has been seen by more than 65 million viewers. Her content comes up now and then in our teen Slack channels, and we're just big fans of her thinking.
What that shame does is it sort of isolates you. And when you're isolated, you're not communicating in the workplace. So you're right. I think holding on to these things, holding on to a mistake, holding on to constructive feedback or negative feedback, holding on to a mistake, a big mistake, can certainly take away from the individual high performance and pull away from kind of this culture of excellence that we keep talking about.
It's interesting. If you look at Asemio, and it's very easy to remove complexity and nuance from people and organizations, and we all try and fit things in categories. And Asemio can be seen as a technology for social good organization, right? But then if you are like, oh, okay, well, I think how we can be perceived is then more hippy dippy. Like I was a Peace Corps volunteer, right? So it's like, oh, Peace Corps. I thought that was when I first heard about it, I was like, that sounds like a pretty hippie thing, like a do-gooder, tree hugging, like go over to and help people kind of thing. And that's so myopic. People can often see military and social support as diametrically opposed. And so, what's your thought on whether that's a misconception, what overlaps might exist in these institutions, and then how like these things shape our understanding of power, economics, and social good?
Just digging down to it, comparing military to nonprofit work, I think there are a lot of similarities, right? We're driven to serve. It is full of people that are driven to serve. I think the other thing I think I'd say is it is people business. The Navy, of all the organizations I've been in, as far as taking care of your people, okay, the Navy was all about the people. It's not about making the most money, right? It's about the people. It is a large people organization, and I sort of think of nonprofits the same way. That's a scope I'm not familiar with. Nonprofit with the world. It's not something I've worked in or touched on, but I can see a lot of the similarities, in that it's driven to serve and not just make as much money as you can. As far as what I do in private equity and how that might compare, yeah, I think it's very difficult to come up with comparison. And private equity it's sort of a four-letter word because you hear these horror stories of private equity coming in and cutting that thing just to make a little bit of return. And before you know it, that company doesn't exist anymore. Those are horror stories. I think they're few and far between. I think the media can point to those stories, and that's what gives private equity a four-letter word. But I think in general, at least what we're doing here at Argonaut, coming in as that growth capital, is maximizing value for both shareholders and its stakeholders. And how are we maximizing value for stakeholders? I mean, think about the trillions of dollars of capital that's private money that's in private equity. The amount of jobs that's been created out of that, I don't see how you can look at that and think that's not a good thing.
So okay, this is going to be AI. I should almost put a trigger warning for AI coming up. But interestingly, so DARPA had this whole AI versus human dogfight. They had the first simulated dogfight where an AI was able to beat a human. And I believe this was because they'd had it in simulations on like video before, but I believe this was in an actual aircraft where they're simulating. I'm curious what your thoughts are, because as we see AI, either reaching at almost achieving human level performance in things like very complex situations like dogfights in the air in fighter jets.
I think we always put a lot of value on the man in the box, right? Or the woman in the box, and what the decisions that they have to make on the fly with ever-changing situations. It seems to me, I think we're still a long ways away from being able to perfectly make the right decision, AI to make the right decision in a changing rules of engagement scenario with many, many, many fog of war moving parts going on the ground on whether you should employ that weapon or not. Now, could AI make that decision and do it without mistakes? No, I think they'll make mistakes, but humans make mistakes as well. So in the end, I think it's a matter of time before AI is probably the one that's in the box and the man is no longer in the box when it comes to fighter naval aviation. That'd be a sad day. How are we using it? I think here we're still in the early stages of that. I've struggled. I've looked into this. I've struggled in terms of the types of portfolio companies that we have, finding where AI can make a difference in our value creation plan for that company. Other than using AI for marketing purposes, right? Flyers or some sort of marketing strategy that goes on LinkedIn or video or something goes on. I've struggled to find a way that AI can truly make a difference in a company of the size and caliber that we're working with. Just haven't found that yet.
That rhymes with the social impact space, with federal, state, and local government. A lot with it's a both and. This technology, as someone that's been closely studying technology for over 30 years now, this is absolutely one of the most powerful technologies we've ever invented, like by far, for many, many reasons that we've talked about in other podcasts. But you can see, like, even if you look out into the capital world, the top 4 or 5 companies are all data-driven companies, and AI is absolutely the next level of data-driven type work. If you pull out Saudi Arabia's oil reserves, then, but still, we're not sure how to use it. A lot of foundation program officers we're talking to and data leaders are kind of thinking and innovating and ideating. A lot of policymakers are unsure. There's federal commentaries right now of different agencies asking, well, what do the experts think? And the academics are all debating and arguing. And we although few people don't see it being significant these days, it used to be that people are like, oh, this is generative AI is a flash in the pan. Few people say that now. They're like, okay, this is significant, but we still don't know how exactly. And I believe that's because our socio-technical systems, our institutions, our process systems are all based upon not having the level of AI we have. And you need to break the process structures and the market structures and stuff in order to rebuild on top of the powers and abilities that generative AI and large language models bring in. And until we do that, we're not going to see a lot of that. Now, you're going to see disruption in some areas, and you already are for sure.
What an opportunity. These business processes you're talking about, like inventory management, I can think of one, a hedging strategy that's AI based. There's so many opportunities. I think it's just so new that it just hasn't been developed yet, Aaron. But it's on its way. What an opportunity, and something we will always be interested in hearing about.
Thank you for taking time out of what I know is an extremely busy schedule to talk to us and help share your wisdom and align to how we think about data and technology for social good.
Yeah, thanks for having me.